Good morning and welcome again. It's great to see you all. Last Sunday, if you were around, you remember we celebrated our first birthday. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone for the cake and the gifts and all the things that happened last week. We were really thrilled to celebrate. You might remember I orchestrated it so we could celebrate my birthday the same day. So yeah. Truly spoilt and very much appreciated. So thank you, everyone. And so, as I say, it's great to see you all this morning. And we're continuing this teaching series that we began at the start of the year, where we're exploring what it means to be fully alive. Saint Irenaeus, a bishop in the church in the AD 100s, famously said these words: "The glory of God is man fully alive." That God is committed to us becoming fully alive in Him, and that in some strange way, our lives and God's glory are sort of bound together in that process. That us experiencing life and life unto its fullness is rooted in God's glory. Jesus reinforced this statement in John 10:10. He says, "The thief," and when he says the thief, he's referring to the devil or Satan or the one who robs us of our faith. He says, "The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I've come that they may have life," meaning all of us who follow Jesus, "they may have life and have it to the full." But to live a life that's full, as we've been exploring over the last couple of weeks, to live life in its fullest sense doesn't mean that we have like a problem-free life. It doesn't mean that life doesn't come with its challenges. It doesn't mean that we don't experience pain. And actually being fully alive means learning to discover a fullness of life in the midst of both battles and adversity and blessings, in moments of celebration and joy and that experience of good things happening. We walk through life not in this sequential way where we have a season of blessing and a season of battles, season of blessing, season of battles. But more often than not, life is like on a train track. And one side of the track, we experience God's blessing and kindness and goodness. And then the other side of the track, we experience battles to be had and faced. And so, as we said last time, becoming fully alive ultimately means becoming more like Jesus. That the life of Jesus would dominate us. That we would become increasingly more like Him. That's the goal of a fullness of life. And so the question we asked a few weeks ago is, what's your plan to become more like Jesus? That we have to be intentional about our pursuit of Him. What are you going to do? You see, all of us who have entered into a relationship with Jesus, we're recipients of His grace, aren't we? That His grace abounds to us, and there's nothing we can do to earn that grace. There's nothing we can achieve. And whilst grace is free and opposed to our ability to earn anything or to take any credit, grace isn't opposed to our effort. That we actually, in light of grace, as ones who've received God's grace, our response is to apply ourselves, to apply our effort by training ourselves to become more like Him. We said it's a bit like training for a marathon or training for a triathlon. You don't just wake up one day and think, I'm a triathlete. You have to train. You have to be intentional. And that's what following Jesus is like. We have to train. We don't earn anything from following Jesus, but we have to train to become like him. And so last time we were together like this, we said it's that training starts in our mind, a battle for our mind, that we need to learn to train our minds to no longer conform to the patterns of the world around us, but actually that we would learn to renew our minds, learn to think differently about who we are and who God really is. And the one real practical way that is that we have to replace some of the destructive thoughts that we have, some of the destructive patterns that distort the things that are in our minds that rob us of living in truth. And you might remember I said one of the ways that we combat that, one of the ways we face that battle for our mind is to speak the truth of the scriptures. That the scriptures, the Bible, is a book that has power to bring life and transformation. You know, one of the reasons why we might remember key passages in the Bible is because when those thoughts enter our mind, we have a way to combat what is being said. And it's true to say that, you know, as we think about the mind, as we think about the battle for our mind, we also have to consider another aspect of our makeup as a person. And we have to think about our hearts. And so this morning, I want to kind of address the idea of our sense of emotional well-being, where we might need to invest next as we consider what it means to be fully alive. And so to do this, I want to try and address a problem. And that's the problem of hurry. It's true to say that a sense of peace and fullness of life is often a commodity that feels quite rare in our day and age. Instead of sensing a sense of peace and fullness, many of us live lives that are stressed, worried, hurried, or busy. Have any of us ever felt like hurry or busyness is like a sickness inside of us that we don't seem to be able to control or do anything about? Anyone ever sense that in your life, that there's a sense of hurriedness and busyness, and it's a sickness within us? One person who has some interesting thoughts about the concept of hurry is a pastor and author by the name of John Ortberg. John Ortberg was a Presbyterian pastor. He's written a number of books that some of you may have come across. But on one occasion, he was describing a season of his life where it was particularly busy. He was serving on staff at a very large church in Chicago. It was a busy church. His family life was busy. You know, his kids were growing up and he was running around after his kids. And in the midst of that, he had this growing awareness of how his pace of life was kind of having an adverse effect on his own sense of health and vitality. And so he sought out some help, and he had the opportunity to talk to a mentor who was quite distant to him, but he had an opportunity to speak to a mentor on the telephone, and that mentor was a guy called Dallas Willard. And so he took this moment to share how he was feeling and what was going on in his life. And when he finished speaking, he said there was this long pause on the end of the telephone, and he waited, and then at last Dallas Willard said something. He said this. He said, "You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life." And then it was followed by another long pause. And John Ortberg was like, okay, I've written that one down. That's really good advice. What's next? You know, after all, he's talking to the Dallas Willard. You know, this man who's known for an amazing mind and amazing wisdom. And this is a telephone call that you don't get to have too often. So, okay, number one, eliminate hurry. Okay, what's number two? But he said there was another long pause. And Dallas Willard said, there's nothing else. You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. John Ortberg went on to reflect, and he said this. He said, for most of us, the great danger is not that we will renounce our faith, is that we will become so distracted and rushed and preoccupied that we will settle for a mediocre version of it. We will just skim our lives instead of actually living them. You see, one of the great illusions of our day is that hurrying will buy us more time. But as Carl Jung said, hurry is not of the devil. Hurry is the devil. In the 1960s, experts in time management within the US Senate advocated that due to the advancement of technology, that within 20 years, so by the 1980s, people would have to cut back on how many hours a week they would work, or how many weeks a year they would work, or even start retirement early, because the great challenge to come, due to technology advancing, would be figuring out what to do with the excess of time. Yet the reality is, technology has in fact done the exact opposite. So instead of working less, what do? We work more. We multitask. We take calls while driving our car. We reply to emails while eating our lunch. We have lost the ability, haven't we, to switch off. We've lost the ability to disconnect. John Ortberg says, never before in human history has society been so things rich and so time poor. We live with what some people refer to as hurry sickness. One psychologist said this, defining hurry sickness. He says, above all, hurry sickness is a continuous struggle and unremitting attempts to accomplish and achieve more and more things or participate in more and more events in less and less time, frequently in the face of opposition, real or imagined, from other people. My guess is in a room like this, we all understand what hurry is and the problem it brings. But although it seems like that is a cultural problem for those of us here in the 21st century, hurry sickness is not a new issue. And the scriptures seem to have something to say about lives that live with the symptoms of hurry. If you've got a Bible, we're going to be in Matthew 11, and we're going to pick up in verse 28. We're just going to look at some words of Jesus, see what Jesus has to say about experiencing lives that are hurried. Jesus says this, he says, come to me, verse 28, all who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened. If there was anything that comes from a culture of hurry, is a sense of weariness and burden. The Greek word here for weary has this connotation of living life with a pace that produces exhaustion. And many of us don't have to look too far to understand what that means. To feel that we are living lives at such a pace that we experience extreme exhaustion. How many of us finish our working week just totally exhausted, totally wiped out? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't work hard. There's a lot of good reasons why you should work hard. Proverbs 14:23 says, all hard work brings a profit. But if we're going to live and, if we're going to live and be comfortable, if we're going to put food on the table, we need to work. We need to work hard. Now, I understand some of us might not be able to do that due to sickness or unemployment, but I can guarantee even if we don't work for a living, all of us understand the benefits of being productive, the benefits of being productive. But if we're going to be people who experience a fullness of life, then we need to learn to fight the temptation that allows exhaustion and our activity and our productivity to become like some kind of status symbol. That in some odd way, our exhaustion and our overwork and our sense of production, if you like, feeds our self-worth and our identity. And we're all kind of guilty of doing that. Because if I can make sure you now know how hardworking I am, even though some of you think I only work for 3 hours a week, if I can let you know how hardworking I am and how late I stayed at the office and how many hours I did that I didn't get paid for, then surely somehow you will respect me more, look up to me and know that I'm just this really hard-working person. We're all guilty of doing that kind of thing. Or worse, we can project that way of thinking onto our relationship with God. And somehow get into this frame of mind where we believe God will somehow reward our heroic behavior because we're so hardworking. But the thing about Jesus is he never played that game. Time and time again, Jesus resisted the temptation to keep going and allow hurry to define him. Mark chapter 6 and verse 21, Jesus and his disciples have been feeding and ministering to 5,000 people. And they say that was just the men. So there's a good chance there was 9,000 or 10,000 people. Not a bad day's work, if I say so myself. A busy afternoon. And it says this, it says, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. You see, there were moments in Jesus' ministry when it was busy, so busy that they had to skip lunch. And you see, Jesus' response to his disciples wasn't, like, well done, guys, you've worked like dogs. I'm really proud of you. You've really shown me your commitment today. I've got so much more respect for you because you've worked so hard. Jesus never said that. He said this. He said to them, come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest. In other words, guys, let's ditch the crowd. Let's stop being busy. Let's stop healing the sick. Let's stop feeding the hungry. All good things to do. And let's get some rest. Let's rest. You see, that's always Jesus' response. If you're weary and burdened, come with me and I'll give you rest. If we want to follow someone, and in our case, we want to follow Jesus, we can't go faster than the one who's leading us. We can't go ahead of the one who's leading us. Jesus was often busy, but he was never hurried. Being busy is an outward condition. Being hurried is a sickness of the heart. Verse 29 of Matthew 11, Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." What might Jesus want to teach us? What might Jesus want to say about living a hurried existence? Well, let's think about this in light of God's created order. God creates all things. And it says on the sixth day, what did he create? On the sixth day, it's not a trick question. He created man. Wow. It's in the book of Genesis, start of the Bible. On the sixth day, God created mankind. And after creating mankind, he gave mankind vocation, didn't he? He gave them a job to do. And then what happens? On the seventh day, which in fact is Adam's first day on the job, on the seventh day, what do? They rest. They rest. I mean, who gets a job and your first day on the job is a day off? Sounds like a great deal to me. That God creates all things. He creates human beings in his likeness, gives them dominion over all creation. And he said, to start with, I want you to rest. I want you to rest. Could it be that in creation, the first thing that God wants to make clear to us is that he loves us, not based on what we do, but who we are. And so we see this rhythm in creation, a rhythm of 6 and 1. 6 days of activity and 1 day of rest. Now, some of us never take a day off. And you've told yourself you don't take a day off because the world will stop spinning if you do. The reality is you're not God. And actually, you not being productive 1 day a week is not going to change anything, honestly. But when we don't take a day off, we are working against the rhythm that God created in order for human beings to flourish. God designed us to be productive, but he also made us to rest. And the thing that we have to know in the creation narrative is the order that rest comes. Rest is first. You see, creation works from a place of rest. Instead, we rest or we collapse having worked our socks off for the whole week. And so the question we might want to ponder this morning is, do you take a day to rest? I know personally that can be really hard. There's always something to be done, something that needs your attention. Do you have a day once a week where you disengage, where you are intentionally unproductive? Now, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. Some of us will know what a yoke is. A yoke is something that's sat over the shoulders of an ox in order for an ox to pull a burden or pull a load. But what's more important to add to this language of yoke was that it was also a phrase used by rabbis and teachers, religious teachers, in relation to their disciples, the people who followed them. So when a person became a disciple of a rabbi, a follower of a teacher, it was referred to as taking on the yoke of your rabbi. And so the disciples would commit themselves wholeheartedly to what their particular rabbi had to teach. And in turn, they would devote themselves to become like the one they were following. So when Jesus says these words, take my yoke, he's not just making a nice metaphor about an ox pulling a load, but he's saying, center your life on me. Imitate me. Take my yoke. And his phrasing is really important here. He says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and take my yoke. In other words, take my burden. He's saying really clearly here, come to me with your burdens and exchange it for mine. You see, the call to follow Jesus and the pursuit of his kingdom in this world is to lay down our yoke and to take on his. You know, we can yoke ourselves, can't we? We can yoke ourselves to all kinds of different things, particularly when it comes to the activities of what we do. We can yoke ourselves to achievement, which often leads to us being overcome with comparison. We can yoke ourselves to appearance where we become something we're not, and that can be a burden. That can be burdensome. And we can yoke ourselves to approval, looking to others in our lives, longing for their approval. I don't know if you've ever suffered from that sense of needing people's approval. It wears you down. It's painful. Verse 29, Matthew 11, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. It's important that Jesus says this because often we don't give Jesus everything because we don't fully trust him. But he says he's gentle and humble of heart. In other words, he's sincere. You don't have to work yourself to the bone for him. You don't have to become something you're not for him. You don't need his approval because he already accepts you. That's a good deal. And his promise is that when we take his yoke and learn from him, he says we will find rest for our souls. For his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And so how do we make this practical? You know, we know, don't we, that the sickness of hurry is a reality that we experience in our culture. How do we, as those pursuing Jesus, make this a practical, intentional step to fight against this? Well, in the language of the New Testament, there are two understandings for the word for time. The first of those is chronos time, where we get the word chronological. It's this idea that time begins and time ends, where it always feels like there's never enough time because time is always moving. But another word for time is kairos, which is slightly different because it talks about time as an experience in a moment. So, you know, the moment your spouse proposed to you, or the moment your child was born, or the moment you got that promotion at work. Significant moments in time. That is what a kairos moment is. You see, if you and I are going to live a fullness of life in a world driven by the sickness of hurry, we need to learn to experience kairos in a world driven by time, in a world driven by chronos. Sorry, can't get it out of my mouth. We need to experience kairos in a world that's driven with time that it's here in a moment and it's gone in the next. You see, whilst the world around us is living at a pace that's out of control, we as God's people should be experiencing those kairos moments where we would learn to become people who experience the presence of Jesus in our lives in the everyday busyness of what our life is. And so I've got a couple of challenges for you this week as we learn to experience what it means to experience kairos in those chronos moments, as we seek to find rest in the midst of hurry. First of all, as you enter your working week, and I have no idea what all of you do, But I want to challenge you this week to take your lunch break every day. Okay? What do I mean by that? What I don't mean is sit at your desk with your lunch and carry on working. I don't mean that. Okay? What I mean is walk away from your desk, close your laptop, turn off your screen, and choose to have your lunch in a different place to where you work. And as you eat your lunch and you set aside that time that for many of us, work doesn't pay us for, as we eat our lunch, remember the words of Jesus. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and take my yoke, and I'll give you rest. So that's the first challenge that I want to invite you to. Some of you are looking at me like, I'm not sure I can do that. But take an hour's lunch or half an hour's lunch, whatever you've got, but away from your desk. I also want to invite some of you this week to set aside 1 hour of solitude. Don't mind when you do it, okay? But 1 hour of solitude. And so for 1 hour this week, take some time where you can still your soul. Free yourself from distraction and occupy a place of solitude. And some of you are thinking, you don't know the noise that will go on in my head if I do that. Well, it might. But how could you start by just practicing this moment of solitude? Well, just take 1 hour and be silent. Then as you kind of begin to drown out the noise and everything around you, see what Jesus has to say to you in the midst of that. And as you do, maybe record your thoughts, write them down. Henri Nouwen says this: many of us are driven. Solitude pokes a hole in our drivenness and helps to stop us for a moment. It means taking some time this week to listen to God's voice and listen to God's voice when he says, you are mine and I'm yours. You don't have to prove yourself. You are fine as I've made you. No performance is needed. No approval is required. Do we think we could do that? Like 1 hour. That's like 1 hour and you've got 168 of them to choose from. Okay? So 1 hour of solitude. You see, becoming fully alive, learning to rest well, learning to stop, learning to center ourselves, not on what we do, but learning to discover who we truly are from a place of rest is where we find life. And in inviting you to do this, I'm aware that it's the counter opposite to how we've been formed by the world. We all know, don't we, that we have two things that we're discipled by as Christians. We're discipled by Jesus, hopefully, but we're also discipled by the world around us. Did you know that you're a disciple no matter what? Yeah, you're either being formed by Jesus or you're being formed by something else. And many of us have been formed by this relentless rat race of hurry that our world comes at us with. And so choosing to take some simple little steps. You know, I could say have a day off and some of you would have a heart attack. Okay, but maybe a step towards having a day off is I'm going to have a lunch break every day and I'm going to choose to remember that I can become unproductive and the world keeps turning. And for some of us, it might be, you know what, I'm just going to take an hour out of the 168 hours I've got. I'm going to take an hour of silence and solitude. I'm going to be in God's presence and remind myself that I'm his and he's mine. And I don't have to achieve anything to win his approval or gain his affection because he's for me already. And so we want to be the kind of people who are being formed not by hurry and stress and overachieving, but we're people who are learning to live life from a place of rest. Amen? Okay. We've gone horribly over. Why don't we stand and we'll quickly pray?